Making indie games is incredibly difficult. It takes a ton of time. It can take years, in fact, to release your first commercial release. If there's anybody who understands this, it's Ken Levine. Not only is Ken Levine the creator of the Bioshock series, he's also making a game called Judas. And Judas, it has taken 10 years to make. We talk about the future of game dev with AI. We talk about politics in video games. We talk about materialism, why Judas took 10 years to make, meditation, staying confident as a game dev. We talk about something called narrative Lego. It's really interesting. It's basically a solution to, well, why linear games are difficult to sell these days. And then also taking risks. Whether you're indie or AAA, taking risks is a huge factor of being a successful game dev. Man, this conversation was amazing. You're gonna learn a ton. The first thing I asked him was all about, well, is AI going to hurt the game industry?
Boy, I can see this video shopping in 5 years. Ken Levine, predicts everything incorrectly. But I'm just going off my limited knowledge I have.
I got you.
My experience. So you can train it on, say, Shakespeare's writing, right? And you can ask it any question about Shakespeare's writing. The problem with creation is we don't know how it happens, right? So you can train on Shakespeare's writing, but you can't train it on Shakespeare, the person, right? Because what is I'm a guy who believes sort of in a very materialistic view of the universe. And I believe our personality is a function of our the molecules that make our body and the molecules that we're interacting with in the world, including other people, right? Mm-hmm. We don't know what causes creation or how it gets created. And we may be very similar to large language models. We may just be soaking everything up and using all that stuff to complete our own sentences, right? Because we're trained on the stuff around us. Like language, how do we learn language? We learn it from hearing mommy and daddy talk, right? When we're babies. But we don't know how it's made. So how do you write a new Shakespeare play without knowing Shakespeare? And how do you know Shakespeare, right? It's very hard to, because he's no longer here, and we don't even know what made that shit come out of his head. And if all those experiences you have probably help form it, most writers say, and I think it's fairly true, I'd feel this way, is that especially at some point in your script, it starts writing itself, and you get ideas, and you're like, where did that come from? And that's the part of creation that it has no insight into. Now, maybe it can develop that, but right now I'm not seeing it. Now, for things like still images, it's pretty powerful because it can, that's a single moment in time. It doesn't have those, continuity issues that I talked about before. But in the end of the day, if you try to then say, well, I really want it more like Kubrickian or more this, it's not really, it tries. So I've yet to find a creative use for it that I've yet to find a creative use for it.
In its current state, it can't comprehend the creator. It can comprehend the created, but it can't comprehend the creator. It's almost like saying it can't comprehend its God. Like the thing that created it, it just cannot get into that dimension no matter how hard it tries.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, because we can't, because it's not written down anywhere. Now, maybe if there's a world where, and I won't go too into it, but there's a concept in the game, Judas, where characters can be reprinted.
Before we dive into the conversation with Ken, I want to say a huge thank you to Ovani Sound. They are the sponsor of this video. They are what makes this podcast possible. Making music and sound effects for your games can be very tough and time-consuming and confusing, but Ovani Sound, they make it easy with their premium music and sound library designed specifically for game development. That's pretty cool. Everything is royalty-free, including commercial use, and also there's no crappy AI used in their production. As a special deal, they're reopening their huge Black Friday bundle for just one final week, and it's just for you guys. This bundle includes 17 brand new sound effect packs, like guns, explosions, and environmental ambience, and many other essentials for games. And plus 20 music packs, each with 3 intensity levels for seamless dynamic control in your games. You also get a voice pack from professional voice actor Rory Childs to fully voice characters without AI.
Gotcha.
Plus their plugins for Godot, Unreal, and Unity to simplify sound integration and dynamic music. The offer ends in 1 week, so for those of you who missed the Black Friday bundle and you want everything you need to start making your game sound amazing this year, definitely click the link in the description to check it out. Thanks, Ovani Sound, for making this conversation possible. Let's jump right in.
Meaning, from a map of your molecular data, you can be born again. Essentially, they track your all your data at all times in the sort of storage device. And theoretically, if you are just your molecules, right, it would make a replica of you at that time with all the memories, all the emotions, all your flaws, all your strengths intact. But it's still a black box. Like, it doesn't really know. It's just saying, here's a map. Let's just recreate the map using very advanced 3D organic printing. So it's sort of drawing on things we already have now, but we don't really have a good way to map us down to the atomic level. And there are parts of our body we understand how they work, mostly like the heart, and there are parts of our body which we're completely baffled by, like our brain, mostly baffled by. We have very high level guesses. So what makes the creation process? Well, it's probably chemicals of some kind, right? Because that's what we are, and electricity and all that other stuff, but we don't know how to map it. So how do you create it without mapping it? I'm not sure, but I'm happy to be proven wrong. Man,
that's so interesting. So it's interesting what you said about in Judas, you could be reprinted. And the question is, like, if I was to disintegrate you and then but I knew every integral piece of data about you, down to the DNA, down to the chemical structure, and I reprinted you, would you still be Ken? I don't think you would be. I think you'd be a duplicate. You would not be you. It's not like you would suddenly consciously manifest in that new 3D printed body.
Well,
what do you think?
Well, I don't know. Like, it depends. If there's a metaphysical element, then no. Like, but I'm not a metaphysical guy, right? So
right.
We can separate the fiction of Judas, which I won't get into whether there's a metaphysical element or not. But
right,
sort of, if you just viewed it in an entirely material way. And again, remember, I was a drama major, so last chemistry class I almost failed was in 1982 or something, 83. But from my thinking about it, from conversations about it, if you are a function of your material, and all your personality and all your hopes and all your dreams and all your memories were in your chemicals, and you can take a snapshot of you, like, wouldn't you be you? I mean, a clone is just going from DNA, right, and growing from DNA, which is starting from the beginning, essentially. So you wouldn't have all those things. You'd be a baby, etc., and you wouldn't have any of those, anything that happened in your life. You would just be the function of your DNA.
Yeah.
But DNA is code too, right? So life. The more we learn about the universe, leaving aside things like quantum mechanics, the more it seems that we are we are a function of some kind of programming. Like, DNA is literally programming.
Yep. It's so strange. It to me, it always felt like, using code and making games. I've always said this on my channel, it feels like you're playing God. It's this strong desire in me. I'll just speak for me. I have this strong desire to create worlds and have those worlds reflect me. Like, they reflect exactly who I am deep down inside. They're reflected inside of Unity, or in your case, Unreal. And a big question I have for you is, you're hesitant to say, this is, like you say, I'm a drama major, yet your games are so philosophical, and you confidently shout out your philosophical beliefs for that specific game, right? So let's say Infinite, talking about American nationalism and religion, right, and combining those two. You confidently shout out, this is the theme and this is what I'm saying, as loud as you can. Do you find it easier and more justified to say something through your art than through something like social media or through this podcast?
Yeah, I tend not to present politically on those things for a bunch of reasons. One is, who gives a shit, right? What I think. Because anybody can sit down and type out, 256 characters or whatever it is, 180 characters. Or I like reading it, though sometimes I have to shut it off because it's, sometimes it's a little too real. And I find that I'm super lucky because my job, I'm given a forum in which to think about these things in a very broad way, right? I'm not just writing a 180-word post. I get years to sit around and stew and talk to very smart people who work with me. And we have long conversations about, these societies and the people and how did it happen, right? How to get there. And then you sort of figure out, what would happen as close as we can get to reality and try to make it feel real, even if it's all of our games, like they're fantastical in their setting, but the people we try to make as real as possible. So I feel I'm lucky. And if I have a political thought, I can express it through the game. Now, it's much more complicated to express a political thought in the game than it is on Twitter, because you've got to, who's the character who's saying it? You have to model him, and you have to rig him, and you have to hire an actor, and you have to do all these things. But it's you get to reach a lot more people, and you get to say a much more comprehensive thing, because like in all the games you say, I think you said it, we speak confidently, but to some degree, like none of those games are about saying America is bad. I love America. I think the United States of America is a great, great country. However, and has some great philosophical underpinnings, primarily about individual liberty and about balance of power, separating the powers. But it can turn into a belief system, an unquestioning belief system, like anything else. Same with objectivism. I've read Rand, and I found a lot of really interesting things there. But I also, see what can happen when people stop paying attention to reality and they keep their nose in the ideology. So I've always been very interested because I've studied, and this is mostly after I got out of college. I was kind of not particularly well read in college. I was not a great student. I was mostly putting on plays and trying to meet girls. That was my college experience, with mixed success on both fronts. But but I started reading a lot after college, and I just got very interested in topics. I started history, and then I don't know how I came across Rand. I just did at some point. I don't know why. And then read that and thought that was really interesting. But also, that became a sandbox, intellectual sandbox to play around with those ideas and what happened if you took real people, rather than this sort of, she tends to write these paragons, either, sort of villains or paragons. But I think she's quite a good writer the Fountainhead is a great pot boiler of a novel, but I want to play around with the ideas and see what happened if you really let them loose and they had to contend with reality. That's the problem with all ideology, right? It bumps into reality at some point.
Is it an art director's job to put what he believes into an artistic frame, or is it his job to put an idea, even if he doesn't believe it, into an artistic frame? And really the question is for you, your games, is it your beliefs systems that go into the game, or is it simply, I just want to explore this, I want to explore that?
Well, a couple of things. Well, art director, so I'm a creative director, not an art director. An art director is the person who would drive the visual look of the product, which I work with the art director. Mm-hmm. But as a writer, say, I believe the job is to inhabit the character as much as you can and see the world through their eyes. So when I wrote Andrew Ryan, for instance, I wanted to take all of his trauma and all of his life experience and understand how he got to the place he got to. And I wanted to, there's a term I love called steel manning, which is if you have an opponent in your argument. I often do this with my friends. We'll be arguing about something and I'll say, hey, steel man my position, or I'll try to steel man his position, which means make the best argument for a position. Even if you really disagree with the position, try to make the best argument. And it's a great way to tell if the person you're arguing with really understands what you're getting at. Because if you can't contend with the best argument of your opponent's position, you're not really debating them. I also think debate is great practice for young people too, because it often makes you don't get to choose what side you're on in the debate, right? So, with Bioshock, I had to make an argument for, through Ryan, I made an argument for objectivism, or the type of pseudo-objectivism we use. Through Comstock, I had to make an argument for, American exceptionalism and white nationalism, which is a very strange place to be, right? Because
Exactly.
I'm not a white nationalist. And I probably not, a lot of white nationalists are probably not big fans of mine.
Right.
But you have to live through your characters and not judge them, so you can present them honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're just doing a blow up doll of them, you're not really telling the whole story. You're more writing propaganda than you are writing. I'd rather write questions than answers.
Right.
And let the audience participate in figuring out what's right.
I love that. And I feel like there's something of that that's lost in the movies right now, games right now, where it just doesn't feel nuanced, and it doesn't feel like there's room for exploring ideas that are questionable. Like I wonder, do you think, we can cut this out if you want, do you think that Bioshock Infinite would be a game that would be allowed right now? Like especially that first sequence where you pick up the baseball,
yeah.
right? Would your publisher say, hey, bro, you got to take that out? By the way, if you're like me and you always dreamt of making an indie game as a full-time job, I have a free webinar below that goes into exactly how to make six figures with just a demo. I was just like you for years. I thought I had to make a game in its entirety before getting a paycheck, but there's actually 3 ways to make six figures before even finishing your game. I've done this multiple times, so check it out below if you do want to go full-time indie. And thanks for watching.
I think it would be allowed at Take-Two, because Take-Two is an exceptional company, and I'm very grateful to work there, because for instance, our first Bioshock, the first game we did for them, you would essentially murder the little sisters if you had a choice.
Right.
And at the time, there was a bunch of people who wanted to get that game canceled, and including people, we had to argue in the studio, with the publisher, to include that element. Because without that element, I don't think that game is Bioshock. And we had somebody at the publisher who really believed in us, and he supported us, but that was a close deal that almost got taken out. By the time we did Infinite, they trusted me more, but again, it was a very different political time. Mm-hmm. But certainly we had people who were very unhappy with some aspects of Infinite, and outside of the publisher, because they didn't agree with some of the political belief system. I find people tend to like it when their opponents' political belief systems get beat up on, but if their beliefs get beat up on, they get and they'll cheer the thing on. And
yeah,
the truth is, look, I'm infallible. I'm fallible.
Yes.
You should just clip it out. Ken Levine says I'm infallible. I'm very fallible.
Yes.
But I can promise you, I make an effort to not just stereotype anybody.
Yeah.
Just let them live and breathe and try to see the world through their eyes. Even people who end up doing terrible things. I'm fascinated how you get from the baby in the crib to the monster.
Yep.
What happened?
I mean, that's one of my favorite books. It's my third time going through it, is Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And just trying to figure out, like, I still can't wrap my head around it. I cannot wrap my head around what happened. Like, how it all spiraled out of control. And obviously there's the reasons, but it's like, it's so distant. So you go, okay, well, that's that time. That wouldn't happen now, And clearly that's not true. It's like, we're still human beings, right? We still have the DNA that was in the 1930s and 40s. So it's really, really difficult to wrap my head around these crazy movements. You know what I mean?
But you see, we've lived in a time of intense political partisanship. So you can see how people get like political violence, right? You see a crowd who's very excited. You see various crowds. They tend to be on the extreme ends of both sides of the political spectrum. Mm-hmm. I don't even like saying both sides, because
there aren't sides anymore.
There aren't two sides.
It's a collage, dude.
It's a collage. But people out towards the extremes tend to be big fans of political violence, and they'll make excuses for it. And I think we're living in probably people don't know, but like when I was a kid in I was born in the late 60s and grew up in the 70s and 80s, but there was bombings almost every day in the early 1970s by groups like the Weather Underground and the Simonese Liberation Army. I don't know if you know the Patty Hearst story, but there was it's very strange. We don't really learn about it, but there was a lot of sort of extremist leftist groups in the 70s that were doing like almost daily bombings. They tended to be not targeted at people, but they could be. There were kidnappings, there were bombings, there were murders, and it was. I think what happens is you get political movements. Like if you look at the 1960s, you get a lot of political activism, and then some people, most of it out of the Vietnam War. Some people, when the Vietnam War ends, they go home, right, and they say, okay, we've mission accomplished. We've ended the war, but some people don't go home, and they get more and more extreme. And this is not contained to any political affiliation. It can be any political affiliation. And yeah, there's a great book I'm reading now called Days of Rage about the bombings that happened then and the violence that happened then. That was very much a lot of similar language to stuff you see today. But nobody's got the trademark on this. Unfortunately, it's pretty broad.
Man, I mean that makes me sort of shift to my next big question, which is your games are. It's almost like I'm reading like I don't know. You remind me of like Dostoevsky or something, where it's like I'm reading this huge, or I'm playing this huge exploration of a philosophical idea manifest in a fictional world, and I go, well, no wonder he's taken 9 years to make Judas. And has it been 9 years?
I think almost 10.
Almost 10.
But 5 years are really sort of like pre-production to figure out how we're going to make the game, because we're using a very different methodology, a very different methodology than we've ever done before. So there's a lot of R&D with a very small team for the first 5 years or so. Okay,
so my question is this. There's a lot of questions, but the first one, I want to get into why it took 10 years, but the first one is, how do you feel? Like, are you just exhausted, dude? Like,
I yes and no. Like, I like to finish the game, as soon as we can, because it's a long time, and mostly for the sake of the publisher, because every day costs money. Also for the sake of the people on the team, because there's some people who've been very loyal and have stuck with me, throughout this thing, and it's so we're working hard every day to get it to market, and we're in full production, and we're getting stuff done, and we're getting towards that goal. I enjoy working on the game, but I am really also interested in what the next challenge is. But it's hard for me to get my head too far out of what I'm doing, because the way I work is I just say, okay, what's the next problem? Let's go solve it. What's the next problem? Let's go solve it. And that can energize me a lot. So I look, every day I recognize how fortunate I am, because I wake up and I get to go work on exactly the game I want to work on, and exactly the field I want to be in, doing exactly the type of mechanics and storytelling I want to be doing. And I'm surrounded by the people I want to be working with. And if that's not a blessing, I don't know what is. So yeah, but I also love making games, but for many reasons, I would like to, we're trying to get it done as soon as we possibly can. And we're very focused on that goal.
How does this compare to the creation of Bioshock? I was reading some article from 7 years ago, and 7 years ago they tended to, it was like 7, I don't know, maybe it was 6 years, but it seemed like the media was able to take things out of context and get away with it a little bit more than they can now. But the article was basically saying how it was a nightmare, and people were stressed, and you were stressed, and blah, 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 blah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, is that true? Is that true that your life at that time was a lot more stressful than, let's say, right now, even though this one's taken much longer and it seems way more complicated?
It's way more complicated, but again, you level up, and at the time, Bioshock was complicated for the size of the team we had, the service we have. We had never made a console game. We had never shipped a console game before. We were a studio, and part of the studio is in Australia, part of it's here. There wasn't great communication technology. We didn't have Zoom and everything back then. We didn't have Slack, all these tools we have now that are very helpful for remote development. We didn't have the publisher. Why should they have had a ton of confidence in us? We had never had a hit before, right? So there was a lot of pressure for everywhere, and we were a fairly junior team, and it was a big, complicated project. And it was, look, games are hard, man. Anybody who tells you we had a great time making this game, every day was heaven, is either probably making a game that isn't great, because they're not if you don't have a few times in the product, you're just like, oh my God, what the fuck are we doing? You're probably not taking enough chances. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the most fun things. Like, I look back on Judas, and there are problems that we worked on for years, and then you see them working in the game. Mm-hmm. And it's so validating for the team. We've also in the last year really lucked out because we've been able to find a lot of talent. We hired a whole bunch of people from Arcane when that studio closed, which we were massive fans of that studio. So we have like 10 or 11 people from Arcane now. Wow. And, our aesthetics are so aligned. And we've been able to find, we have such a great team that, but look, even with the best team, even with the best project, man, you're looking at bug counts and you got a milestone and you're trying to triage bugs out. It's there's many parts of game development that are very long and very tedious and very stressful. And that doesn't change. I've changed a lot in the interim because having had those successes behind me, I've learned to trust some of my instincts more. And I've also, this is going to sound lame, meditation has been very helpful because it allows you to sort of distinguish from the thing you think you're feeling and what's really happening. And so, where my ability to stay, just to keep myself emotionally stable in stressful situations has improved substantially as I've gotten older.
That's interesting. Me and my team I had a small team of like 4 or 5 people working on my game, which is inspired by your work, by the way. But it was one of the most stressful summers of my life in 2024. And
this last summer.
This summer and this year was brutal. And the game industry, I would love to talk about the game industry and its health, but and we will. But I bring all this up just to say that I found myself freaking out and stressing out, whether it's the publisher. My publisher is 3D Realms, which they're owned by Saber. Freaking out about the publisher, what they think about the project. Are they happy? Are they not happy? Money, blah, blah, blah. And I found myself just constantly stressed, and it was so funny because all I needed to do was just to take a day off. And then it's kind of like meditation where it's like your brain stops the for loop going, and then you just say, oh, and you back up and you look at it and you go, it's just a game. Like, everything's fine. We're okay. And it's actually pretty good. You just need to take the time and the distance away from it. So is that kind of what meditation does for you? It sort of backs you away from the stress of it?
Yeah, I mean, without boring people with like meditation, too much with my meditation talk, it is a way to look at, so say you're feeling super stressed out. One of the things that I learned in meditation is to physicalize the emotion. So what's stress? Oh, my forehead is like this, right? I'm grinding my teeth. And you look at those as physical manifestations. And once you start examining those physical manifestations, they often resolve. And because that's what they are, right? There is no meta narrative of life. It's not like, Ken, you're like, I used to get stressed out and I'd get the stress feeling and I get this buzzing in my head and it'll be like, oh my God, how, and I get stuck with that feeling for days and days until one day I'd wake up and it'd be gone. Now through meditation, I find I can examine those feelings and dissolve them a bit. Mm-hmm. But you're still left with the same problems, right? But it's just the emotional layer you put on top of those problems can be not eliminated, but substantially reduced through practices like that. And I also, I run every day. And so there's a bunch of things I do. But yeah, it is a massive stress thing. Like I remember we had a very, very bad thing happened a few months ago that would have a major impact on the game. And I got the message in the middle. I heard my phone beep in the middle of meditation. And I looked at it and I saw that text from somebody who worked for me. And and then I went back to meditation. I'm like, okay, this is where you would normally freak out. Why don't you just assume you're going to figure it out and trust that and go back to your meditation? Yeah. And lo and behold, that's what happened. And lo and behold, we figured it out.
Yep. The problems tend to be, I've found, so for me, it's like, so I'm religious, I'm Christian, so I'll pray. And it's a similar thing, right? Totally similar. It's just like the ability to basically look at your problems relative to the scale of the universe. I mean, like for me, it's like really this one little milestone that I had an issue with my publisher, like really that's going to be causing me to be snappy with my children or frustrated with my wife? Like, is that really going to be something that is going to ruin my summer? And so it's pulling back and seeing things relative to the size that they actually are. Now, I've found that, I don't know if you approach things this way, but I've found that when there's an issue with my games or the design or something, and it's not working, like we did testing over the summer in May and June, and it was brutal, which it always is, I think.
It always is. Yep.
And, you know, I was just panicked, dude. Like, it was like so depressing. And I started thinking about problems like this, especially in the indie game world or just the game dev world. I started looking at them as I'm lucky to have them, meaning it's like, isn't it so cool that I get to exercise my talent with this pain? It's kind of like working out or running, right?
Yeah.
And you get to exercise through it and become and level up and upgrade. Whereas most people working jobs they hate, they're not going through that. No. You know what I mean?
I mean, the fact that you care about your job makes you incredibly lucky. I mean, in terms of like, you know, scaling it towards other problems in the world, they're still your problems, right? So you still have to deal with them, and that doesn't make them trivial because, you know, they're yours, even though people, you know, your problems are way less than somebody in, you know, stuck in a trench in Ukraine, right? Mm-hmm. But you still got to solve the problems, and you still got to go home and, you know, not take them home to your family as much as you can, right? You know, and try to be at least 60, 70% better about them than maybe when you started, right? Because you're never going to be 100%. Mm-hmm. But testing, you know, you mentioned testing. Testing is so painful, but it's as a developer, it's your best friend in the world. Just putting the product in front of people, seeing how it differs from what you thought it was, because it will. But we've been testing the game for about 3 years now. And at the beginning, it was just, you know, this is a piece of garbage shit, right? There were some things I liked, but basically, and it was not surprising because we were putting it out in front of people the first time.
Sure.
But we just test and test and test. I don't just mean with QA. We bring in friends and family. We even bring in outside groups to test it. You know, people are under NDA and test it. And we just learn, and the game keeps getting better through that testing. But you need a thick skin. One of the things I think is most dangerous for young developers, given we're talking about, you know, development-oriented podcast here. I see a lot of developers who get in fights with their audience on Twitter. And it's literally the worst possible thing you can do, not just for PR reasons, but because if the audience is telling you something, telling them they're wrong is really a waste of time. Because at the end of the day, you know, think about reverse it. You're a consumer and you buy a package of Oreos, and instead of and they don't have any filling, right? And you're like, well, I want the filling, and the guy at the Oreo company says, well, you're wrong. The filling sucks, and that doesn't mean you're going to make the game they want, like or the game they're going to tell you to make, because you don't. Generally, the user are not going to tell you what game to make. They are going to tell you. If you look at consistent feedback of 89% of all the users hate this feature, either the feature's got issues, right, and that you can look at because you can go dive deeper, or it's maybe not a feature that the audience really wants. But at the end of the day, our job is communicating our ideas to an audience. Yeah. And the other thing you should never say to an audience is, you don't know what you're talking about. I have had 40 years, I have 25 years of experience, because that's another fallacy. At the end of the day, they might be right, even though you have all that background and experience. That doesn't mean they are right. It doesn't mean they know what to do. It just means that testing and your audience is one of your, we wouldn't have jobs if not for our audience.
You know, it's so interesting though, because there are instances where the audience was wrong. And I'm a very self-defeating person, so I don't have trouble like hearing feedback, because when I hear feedback, I go, well, of course they're right. My game sucks. You know, that's usually where I go. But I look at books like The Great Gatsby, and it just flopped on launch. It just didn't work, and it took decades and the generation dying out basically before it became this huge, like it's like this legend now. It's part of the American mythos.
Same with Wizard of Oz. Same with 1984. These were not successes at launch.
So the question is like, how do you listen to an audience right? When do you listen early and often? Because they always say test early and often, but it sounds like you guys didn't test early and often.
I'm never going to go say, hey, do you guys want to play a game set on a spaceship with a character called this? And no. When you have playable builds, you go out and you have to ask people to focus on the areas that you think are somewhat representative of your intentions, right? And you can only give them so many known issues because the user eventually will just shut down. Like one of my jobs is playing the game in a broken state and giving user, good end user feedback, which is something I really put a lot of effort into to try to be the gamer when I play the game, our games. But yeah, look, many of us have made games that were either before their time or just weren't right for the audience. Like System Shock 2, our first game, is now regarded as a classic. It was sold almost nothing at the time. Mm-hmm. But by the time we got to Bioshock, I think I understood what was missing from that, and technology had caught up, which is the visual world building. We just didn't have the tools at the time to or the team size or the time to the kind of world environment building that I think Bioshock is known for. And I think that was the missing piece of System Shock 2. And that's what made it sort of a mass market product, because we were able to communicate a lot more effective ideas visually.
If you had listened to the audience and made the changes necessary to ensure that this game really blew up on launch, let's say you put in all the stuff, like all the sugar and the frosting that everybody wanted, and you released it and it did amazing. The thing is you listen to your audience, but you wouldn't have that cult classic that System Shock is right now. It'd be different. And so I've always struggled with that. Like, how do you know if the audience is right, or if you should trust your gut? You know what I mean? Like Bioshock and Infinite and Judas, they have this real, it's like this strong identity that it's not, they're not, what am I trying to say? They're not like the average of what culture wants. You didn't take, hey, culture wants this, so we're going to put it into this game. They're their own unique worlds that clearly came from a singular mind, or at least the impetus was. And that's a much riskier approach than just creating something like a pop culture game, And so it seems like you've got a very courageous bone where you say, this is what I think the game is. This is what it's going to be. I'm not going to listen to too much feedback. I'm going to go with my gut. Is that true?
So quite often you get a piece of feedback, and the trickiest thing is, like, do they really not like this, or is it just needs more time in the oven, right? And the problem is you never really know if it needs more time in the oven, because you can leave it in the oven forever and maybe it'll never get cooked, right? Maybe the oven's not working. And that's a really hard thing to do. Like Little Sisters from Bioshock and Elizabeth are two things that the team really wanted to cut for a long time because they weren't working very well. And I knew those were things that if we didn't have them, the game wouldn't be the game that I wanted to make. And so then it's like, okay, well, what's in the way of this connecting with people? Because there was never like, if the entire audience hates something and the team hates it, it's very hard to say, well, you're all wrong. You can say, I think it needs more time in the oven. And I think it needs add a few ingredients or take a couple ingredients out. And that can be tricky, because then sometimes you work on something. Judas was something we worked on for a very long time, which turned out it was just never going to get cooked. And we took it out, or we modified it substantially. And part of it was it just didn't fit in the game at all. It just wasn't, I don't know, looking back on it, this is all on me. And the team very supported me, and they really tried to make it work. And at some point I just had to say, you know what, guys, this is on me.
What specifically was it, Ken? I'm sorry. What specifically is the thing you cut?
I can't talk about it.
Oh, okay.
It was a fairly unimportant feature that took a lot of work. That was just distracting from the flow of the game, and all the user testers were telling us, and all the team was telling me, and I was like, no, you guys just don't see. And then one day, after enough evidence, like, oh my God, no, this is you get to know yourself, and you can see how you can make mistakes. And sometimes I'm right about these things. Sometimes I'm wrong. And like with the little sister and the Big Daddies and with Elizabeth and Bioshock, I knew I was right, because I knew that was essential to the identity of the game. And this was not at all central to the identity of the game. And it was just taking up a massive amount of time. The players didn't want to spend time in that feature. and we required them to in the process because the way the game is structured,
Yeah.
and we simplified it massively, and all of a sudden the game people massively improved.
So your gut was wrong in that instance.
Yes.
Okay.
And you never know, like when you interrogate yourself, you never know. So you build up people you trust around you. You build up an understanding of how to deal. And my team right now, they all go to we do these playtest sessions with an outside group, and it's new gamers, and we're sort of watching them over Zoom playing the game and being interviewed about the thing. And they don't know we're there. So they'll say their most honest impressions. They'll leave. There's no kindness. They spare us no kindness, or sorry, they give us no kindness, which is great because they don't give a shit, right? When the consumer's going to the store with their $70, they don't give a shit, right, about how hard it was to make or anything. We're asking them for a substantial amount of money, and that's a heavy responsibility, and their time as well, right? And so I like hearing those unvarnished opinions because that's what the consumer will give you when the product comes out, and that's their right. So, but you never know. There's no magic formula. It's just check yourself as much as you can, but also try to develop an eye of a gamer as much as you can and see things as the gamer sees them and not how the developer sees them.
How is it possible that I'm going to assume you check yourself because you're recommending that we do it. How is it possible that Ken Levine can check himself when he's proven that he's a genius? Well, at least with Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite and working on System Shock, like you've proven that your gut is very, very trustworthy. And then you've got all these awards, and you've got, what was it, 100 million copies sold of Bioshock? I can't remember what it was. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was.
Was that much? It was 10, 20,
10 million. Yeah.
Okay. Between all the franchises, it's a lot of units, more than I ever thought we could.
Sure. So point being, how is it that you can check yourself? Like, is it hard? Is it hard not to be cocky? Like, I feel like I would be cocky.
I've actually found the opposite problem. It's hard not to get stuck in a paralytic loop of self-questioning. And so I've learned to trust myself but verify. So if I have a problem, like, okay, I go back and I think about all the horrible problems I've had in game development over time. And I'm like, well, you survived it. You figured it out, Ken, didn't you? So you'll probably figure this one out. That doesn't mean the thing I have in my head right then is correct. It means that I trust a process way more than I trust myself. And my process includes the team. The process includes the people we test with, the QA team. And, then we brought in journalists to look at it too, because I want to make sure that, they were looking at and getting their opinion, and they were lining up with our thoughts too. Because eventually you're trying to say, am I have the same sense of this game as the audience is going to have? And with our games, because they're so particular, there's not a really clear path. You don't have a direct competitor. Say, like Marvel Rivals come out and have a very clear competitor in like Overwatch, right? And they could they know the audience super well. We have our previous games, but Judas functions in radically different ways in many cases than the previous games. So you don't really know. But yeah, I wish I had a really clean answer, but you can look, the history of art is filled with people getting high on their own supply.
Yeah.
But it's also filled with people that if they don't believe in themselves, the game is you need people like confidence. They like confidence in people. They like confidence in the products, that the game is not pretending to be something else,
right,
or afraid to be what it is. The people smell that and they turn away.
Yeah. Do you have moments where you kind of panic about your reputation? Like, and I'm speaking from my own personal ego, okay? So I'm not putting it on you. I'm just saying that's how I am. So, like, I think about my reputation. I think about whether it's YouTube or games. Do you think about, okay, we're going to launch this game, and everyone's going to see it's a Ken Levine game, and they're going to have expectations. Yeah. They're going to expect this, and they're going to expect that. And then they're going to think I'm being pretentious, or they're going to think I'm just stuck in my own world or my own loop, and I can't. Like, do you ever worry about that stuff? Does that make you freak out a little bit?
I worry that the people will like it because we are making a product for an audience at the end of the day. But I also know that worrying, like another methodology I picked up over the years is, like the meditation I was doing. One of the first things the guy says, it's a very non-touchy feely meditation, and he's like, for the next 10 minutes, next 20 minutes, however long the meditation is, you're not going to solve any of your problems. So you need to just check them at the door. And learning to to focus your mind so you're checking things that you can't solve right now is a very good skill set. So you try to stay focused on the problem you have, even at night. Like when I got that message I told you about, that was really a huge problem for us. I was like, well, I'm not going to solve this tonight, so why think about it tonight? And I trained myself to do that substantially. And similarly, I remember when I started and I got to be a little well known, I would read every thread about me on the internet because I wanted everybody to like me. And then at some point you realize that you can't maintain friendships with every single person on the internet. So I don't mind at all hearing feedback, but some people are going to like you and some people aren't going to like you. And you just try to be the best person, the best boss, the best designer, writer you can be. And you take feedback in very honestly, and you make sure you try to create an environment where feedback is welcome. I think that's really important. I have a direct line to every person in my company. We don't have a hierarchical structure where people can't just reach out to me directly. We have an open door policy, and you can't just have an open door policy. You have to really schedule a time with people and check in with them and see how you're doing as much as you can. And I have people also that's their full-time jobs at the company, is just interacting and looking for where the problems are forming and looking where people are unhappy or frustrated. Yeah. But no, you could worry forever about your reputation. Like I could not at this point, people are going to say stuff about me on Twitter. That's totally fine because it has to be fine, right? Don't worry about the things you can't change. Worry about the things you can change. Don't worry about the problems you don't need to solve today. Worry about the problems you need to solve right now.
I've always wondered what it feels like to be one of the sort of legendary game devs that the internet, the early 2000s, when the internet started to blow up, what it felt like to be carried by that wave and the press starts to write articles about you. Do you feel like, you said your team there's an open door or they're able to give you feedback. Would you be scared of you if you were your employee or your team member?
Making games is hard, and I imagine coming in to pitch something to me can be challenging because I ask a million questions. And if I sense a problem in a presentation, I will dive into that problem and really try to see. I ask two basic questions, which have really been helpful. Well, I find them helpful, which is, so like say somebody's pitching a story element, right? Or they show me something in the game, and I don't like it. I don't like the story. The first thing I ask is, what story are you trying to tell? And so that's to make sure that I understand the story he's trying to tell, because the thing on page just may not be a good version of telling that story, right? So the story may be really solid, but the execution isn't good. So I want to make sure before I say I don't like this, I try to say, what story are you trying to tell? So they can say to me, I'm trying to tell a story about a fireman who gets afraid of fire and then he overcomes his fear, whatever it is, right? But on paper, it's like, this is about a guy having a fight with his wife, and I don't see anything about that, right?
I see.
And so I'll say, well, this doesn't really tell that story. Or I'll say, well, I'm not sure that's an interesting story. Maybe, why are you trying to tell this story versus say that story? The other thing is, if somebody comes up with an idea, especially late in a project, I'll often say, well, what problem are you trying to solve? Because if you're not, especially later in development, if you're not trying to fix a problem that exists in the game, you're probably doing the wrong thing, right? You're just adding features forever. And so if they're not trying to solve a specific problem, that often comes out. Or if they don't, especially if they don't know the answer to those questions, then that's where people get most anxious, because the meeting, usually what I do is say, okay, let's stop pursuing this for now and talk about the story, right? Let's talk about the problem. Or, hey, I don't think this solves any problems the game has, and we don't have, unlimited time in the schedule, so let's not do this. Mm-hmm. And I think it's hard. You go in and you want to pitch something and you want the boss to get excited, right? And you want to be like, oh my God, you're a genius. And the truth is, that's rare. It's rare to go to me, and it's certainly rare with an audience, right? There's almost never a thing where I go out to the audience with our first take and they're like, oh my God, you guys are genius. Even Bioshock 1, I think I've told the story a bunch of times, but we tested that thing a few months before ship, and the test was a disaster.
Yeah.
And we had to figure out what wasn't connecting with the audience. And it turns out it wasn't deep surgery. It was some minor surgery, and then we fixed it.
I found that to be true as well with my game over the summer. It seemed so cancerous. Like, it felt like it was just the whole game was the problem.
Yes.
But it was the setup. It was the first 5 minutes of the game.
Teaching.
It was the setup, right? Setting up the story, the character motivations, the setting, the problem to solve for the story, and also how the loop works, And I can't imagine that shit.
Can I say everything? I love what you said about the game feeling cancerous, that you think the whole thing is doomed, and you realize it's not. The cancer hasn't spread. There's one part of it that you got to chop off, or you got to fix, or you got to refocus. And sometimes that sounds like you had good results from that process.
We did, and well, it's not scary for me. It's scary when I think about narrative Lego, and I do want to shift gears and talk about Lego and just narrative Lego in just a sec. But like, for me, I'm making a linear game. Like, it's like classic, like Half-Life, Bioshock, just super linear, right? And it's kind of like making a movie where it's here are the beats, like here are the story beats, and guide the player to the story beats, and I can control generally how long they get to each beat, right? And in order to solve let's say a gameplay problem or a story problem, you just got to focus on that one little beat. And so I went into the first 15 minutes of the game and I fixed that, just the introduction of the character, and put in a little cutscene, and really quick. It was like 2 weeks, and suddenly the first hour of the game is so much more fun. But that brings me to Judas, because to solve it in Judas, to solve a story beat problem, I don't even know where to begin. Because can we just talk about narrative Lego and like what? And it sounds like I should say narrative Legos, but I learned from you it should be narrative Lego.
I learned from other people, because actually my speech called it Lego, so a lot of people got upset with me. We have some huge Lego fans on the team,
right? So to solve a problem, to solve a story beat problem where it's like the story isn't emotional enough or it doesn't make sense, how do you do that with something like Judas? And feel free to give some background about narrative Lego.
Yeah, well, for the purpose of narrative, because narrative Lego is a bunch of things. It's a whole, basically, people should watch my talk if you could include like a link to it.
Sure, it'll be below. Yep.
And again, this was 10 years ago, so some things have changed, but essentially the approach of, and I won't bore people with too lengthy a description. The talk is probably a better place to get it. It's basically a modular approach to building games, where you are able to take a bunch of content, pare it down to what's the smallest unit of content that makes sense. So like, for instance, a piece of furniture, a painting, a line of dialogue, a quest object, a monster, all these things could be, and to put them into essentially a tool we have, which the metaphor finally came to me the other day, because I used to write when I was old enough that I used a manual typewriter for my first writing. And most of you probably never have, and most people probably never have. But if you want to put a paragraph in the middle of a typewritten document, guess what? You're going to have to either literally cut things out and paste them and move them around, or you're going to have to retype basically almost from the beginning. And so your ability to edit dynamically back then was so limited, where now you copy, paste, move paragraphs around, blah, 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 blah. And for narrative, what this tool allows us to, instead of when you build a linear narrative game like Bioshock, like you hardwire things into places, right? And moving them is a massive task, sort of like typing. You have to like we cut a level from Infinite, and it ended up being more work to cut the level than to finish the level, because we had to. There was so much surgery.
Yeah.
But with our tool now, if I want a beat to get moved around, and because our beats are so dynamic, they can be fired off arbitrary set of conditions. If the player has tool X, if the other character has done thing Y, if this monster has appeared in Z, but whatever arbitrary conditions you want, move this element, play this element now, or play it later, or wait until these 4 elements of play plus the player has done X, Y, and Z. And it basically allows you to treat it like a word process, like narrative, like a word processor, and move chunks around very easily at runtime for the player, so we can respond at a very low level to what they do. So now when I write a scene, I may play it and be like, this scene really should not happen. It needs more setup, right? So let's have it happen later and add 2 beats for setup. And those beats can happen at fairly arbitrary points in the gameplay. You're in a level, you're fighting some monsters, and the game says, okay, I'm setting up a beat for 5 scenes from now. In film, they have this term setup and payoff, which is critical for storytelling. I mean, I think you mentioned modern like TV and movies. Now, I think a lot of the problem with modern TV and movies is the character suddenly has the tool they need at the moment they need, and they never bother to set it up earlier, right?
Yeah.
The most obvious example of setup is snakes in Indiana in Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? They set up right at the beginning he's afraid of snakes, and later on he's in a pit full of snakes and he has to deal with it. Setup and payoff, and it's critical. You have to put the thing in the place so it doesn't feel convenient when it finally happens.
Right.
And we can move our setup and payoff. Like if we find we haven't set something up well enough, we can add a setup beat or a second setup beat if we need it, and make sure the other thing happens. The payoff happens later, and move things around. So our ability to edit the narrative and respond to changes it's like going from typewriting to word processing.
Right. I don't even know though. Like, what is that tool in Unreal? You're using Unreal, right?
We built it on. It's a bunch of systems basically built on top of Unreal.
It's conditional. It's conditional statements of code, and then it brings in chunky elements.
Yes.
Whether it's like a cutscene, or a certain character appears with a dialogue.
Yep. A scripted event, a room with certain types of furnishings, or bring in a table that has this type of object in it. And so that object is sitting on a table. Like for instance, if there's a beat we need, like we have a concept called reffing. So like a character will come in and say, point at an object and say, hey, and tell a story about that object, and they'll point at it. All of that reffing is arbitrary, right? The character doesn't really know what it's pointing at. It just knows to point at a location. So we can say, hey, it's time for Hope to show up and talk about story concept X, right? So make a poster appear that has a visual setup for that story, because otherwise she's just talking, right? So bring in a visual poster that we've created the poster. It's none of this is algorithmically generated.
Right.
It's basically a massively complicated tagging and summoning tool where you tag all these objects appropriately, and then the game can at runtime bring in what it needs at that time to a very granular level. So I need to set up the story element, bring in Hope, and bring in that poster. If the player doesn't see her, well, wait a little while and then do it again if the player hasn't seen it, so you don't miss it the first time potentially. And that's working under the hood. Okay.
So is all of this, I'm interested in the impetus for this idea. I've heard you mention Shadows of Mordor being, right? Wasn't that helpful? And
hugely
so
inspirational.
It's the inspiration. Now, is your system
inspirationally how it was built? We don't have all the same mechanics, and we're no way a sequel or a follow-up or a spiritual successor. Right. Just the way they handled modularity was incredibly innovative.
So the technical aspects of this system, is that on you? Or are you just writing the story and you're saying, here are the elements, and it's almost like, do you ever play Mad Libs?
Yes.
Is it kind of like Mad Libs where it's like, here's the story, but here are the places we can fill in various elements? Now, on the technical side, it's like you just tell the team, figure it out, but this is what I need. Or are you going in and figuring it out? Not necessarily coding.
No.
But
So I have zero engineering background, right?
Right.
So I did the talk. The talk was mostly my conception. I may have checked with people to say like, hey, does this sound like completely impossible? But we hadn't built it yet. And when we started building it, and Eric Erlin led that on the technology side on our team, and he very brilliantly, we very quickly had a bunch of modular elements in the game working exactly as I had imagined them working. But there's a huge I mean, it's massively complicated under the hood. Once you learn it, it's incredibly powerful, but it's massively complicated. So no, I'm not the guy in the front line. I have a whole genius group of people, and it's not just programmers. It's like our narrative team, led by Ben Zaks and Drew Mitchell. They'll take story elements and the dynamic stuff has to feel good, and there has to be enough time between beats and things like that. And they're very sensitive, not just to the technology, they're sensitive to the flow of narrative. And so when you see very sort of heuristics are the right word. We don't like the word random. We like the word heuristics, like a billion conditional statements and a billion things checking on each other, almost entirely based on prefabricated things, but what the player is doing. If the player's done this, and the player's done that, and the player's done this, then this happens at this location. Okay. If the player misses it, wait X amount of time and try to respawn it as soon as you can, right? People not just have to build the technology, they have to have the art, they have to have the right side brain of it too, to make it that it feels right. Because if the audience feels like they're getting some procedurally generated thing, that's not what the audience wants from us. They don't want to pay the price for that. They just want a great experience. The kind of experience they expect from us, deep world, deep characters, great world building. But they want it to, I think, our guess is they want it to be more reactive to what they do.
Right.
And so all this work is really going into that, to making the game dynamic enough where the player feels that they can have this conversation with their friends. Wait, what you did? What and what happened? But they still expect the same level of presentation or a better level of presentation than what we've had before.
Okay. That brings me to this huge question I've been thinking about for the last couple of years, because I'm making a linear story game. Now, it's an indie game, so I feel I can get away with it just because it's not as expensive. But like, if you were to spend, I don't know, $10 million to $100 million making a AA or AAA game, to make a linear game that really the player doesn't have much agency at all except for how they play it, like in terms of like the guns. Yep. Is that really risky these days?
I mean, it depends. Like I felt so I had a bunch of impetuses for coming up with the narrative Lego stuff. One of which was I had made a game about how linear games are. Bioshock, the Would You Kindly moment is so much about how little agency you have.
Sure.
And once you make that joke, haha, see how linear we are, suckers. At some point, you've got to then try to do something about it, and we'll see whether or not we're the ones who could do something about that. But then again, so I felt I was frustrated by how stuck we are with linearity, and I knew we needed an approach that was different than what people have done to achieve that. And I knew I had my drama major level of understanding of how that would function, and that came out through the talk. So you'll see by the limits of my technical abilities in that talk. But I have a good technical basis for understanding what's expensive and what's cheap in games.
Sure.
And so that I'm fairly useful in that front. But in terms of what's purely linear games, look, you have Space Marine was very, very successful. Space Marine 2 was very, very successful. So you have a bunch of fairly successful linear games now, but I do think it's harder because an 8-hour experience, especially if you're paying $70, I think when you're getting AAA prices, I think it gets tougher. But the thing about guessing what the audience wants is you're often the audience will often surprise you. You always have, this is dead and that is dead, and somebody comes along and totally nails it. I'm curious to see how Indiana Jones does. Because it's an exceptionally good product. We'll see if it how well does in the audience might be a metric to look for games. But then you have Space Marine 2, which did, my understanding, did super well. And that was old school, right?
Yeah, old school, and that's the parent company of my publisher that made that game, and it was a big moment when it just blew up, and it felt like a return to the classic. What people loved, or at least my generation. I'm 34. What my generation grew up on, which is you put the cartridge in the console, and you start playing, and you go down a path, and you're challenged on that path. I've got 3 kids. They're 10, tired, they're hungry, they're whiny, they're crying. I put them to bed. When I put them to bed, I don't want to open up a game and have to learn the whole ecosystem and crafting and all this stuff. So I'm sitting here going, is Ken trying to give me something I desire while also making it different for every player? Meaning, when I play Judas, is the goal for me to feel like it's a linear game, but it was new for me, and it's new for someone else, and it's new for someone else, and it's new for someone else.
The goal is, it feels like, the goal feels like you are driving yourself, but the experience is customized to you, right? Even though, and to some degree, all games are linear games, right? Because you have one playthrough of it, right? Sure, Minecraft is about as non-linear as they come, but for your experience, it feels like, but what's cool about it is your experience is radically different than your friend's experience. Yeah. And so you feel that the world sees you. Like games are, to some degree, I believe, aspirational. You want to be, it's your time to shine and be the most important thing in the world. Now, again, that doesn't mean you're just doing pure hero fantasies. My games tend not to be that, right? You know, do you really want to be Booker DeWitt, the alcoholic guy who sold, you know, I don't want to do many spoilers, but he did a lot of very bad shit. And you're in his shoes, or Jack, you know, from Bioshock, or Judas is an extremely messy, complicated, brilliant, dark individual.
Yep.
And I like putting the player in shoes of not traditionally heroic, but the thing they all share is they're all very good at something. You know, they're all very, very good at, or a range of things, but they are not perfect personalities. So I like that tension of being in somebody that you're not sitting entirely 100% comfortable with, but they have to be interesting, and they have to be aspirational in some way. Right. I think that there is a good feeling about linear games, that you kind of feel like you're rolling downhill through an experience and every moment feels fresh and unique, and that's super exciting. So I believe there's always a space for everything, you know. In terms of the budgets, you know, we were talking about, in terms of the games I've done, I wanted to do something that did a lot of experimentation. You know, because if we didn't experiment, we wouldn't have Bioshock, right? If we didn't try to merge RPG and first-person shooters, we wouldn't have had System Shock 2. Because System Shock 2 is a pretty different game than System Shock 1. We took a lot of risks. System Shock 1 is more of an adventure game. You got tools at a prescribed time, and you didn't have any numbers to make. You didn't really have choices about how you grew as a character. System Shock 2, we were like, let's try that. And then with Bioshock, we're like, let's try to make the environment really sing. Let's make these big daddy little. I wanted a boss battle that wasn't in an arena, right? That could be anywhere. That was the Big Daddies, and I wanted a companion, and I wanted, you know, the skylines in Infinite. I think if you're not taking risks, you're dead, and you also don't want to define yourself by your past work. Though, of course, we all are. You know, P.T. Anderson films are going to feel like P.T. Anderson films, and you know, Tarantino films are going to feel like Tarantino films. Though he gets to go to Nazi Germany or France, you know, occupied France for one movie, and then he goes to Hollywood for another movie, and so you want to explore different things. But you know, I'm a creator with a stamp, I guess. You know.
Oh yeah.
But that doesn't mean I want to. People often say, "Do you want to go back and do a director's cut of like whatever?" And I'm like, "Oh God, that sounds." Like, I understand why the audience wants it, but to me, it sounds like, look, I've only got so many projects left. I want to take risks. Of course, the problem with taking risks is you can fall on your face too.
Yeah. Well, this leads me to my last question, Ken, and I know your time is valuable, so if you need to hop off, let me know. I have one final question here, which is it's related to the game industry. You know, you're sitting here saying, take some risk and put yourself into a position where you could fall on your face. But the problem is I just feel like the game industry feels really unknown right now. Like, I feel like some people say the bubble burst in 2024. Some people are saying AI is going to ruin it. How do you feel about the industry right now?
So
it feels scary to me, and I don't want to take risks when I'm scared. You know.
So when I say take risks on the level of which you can take risks, right? Like the risk of taking on Judas, like System Shock 2, we made in 14 months. Nobody was going to say to me, you have a large number of years to make a game back then, because I had no proof. And frankly, not many people would have said it to me now, because most publishers don't put the faith in their developers the way that Take-Two does. Take-Two tends to make bets on people. And look, I hope I deliver for them. That's my goal. And I am fully confident to the best of my ability to say, and to test that, we put it in front of a lot of people that we are making the right thing. And then we learn from our mistakes and we move on. I would say you always have to have some level of risk that you're taking on if you want success, that you have to scale that appropriately for where you are in life and where you are in everything. This is true for, I'm sure when you got married and when you decided to have kids, there's a risk, right? I'm sure you weren't fully secure that you would be able to like provide everything those kids needed, but you can wait till you're 40 or 50, right? Or you can't, even if you could, but then you're 40 or 50 when you're having those kids, and it's a different experience than when you have them in your 20s, I imagine. I don't have kids, so I get it. And risks are without risk, there's no life. But that doesn't mean you got to calculate those risks, and you have to take on a limited set of them. Like, for instance, we started the game making Judas as a third-person game. And I was like, this is a big risk, which takes away a lot of things that we know about from our skill set, specifically world building, because just the fact that in first person you can get closer to objects than you can in third person in your face, I didn't want to lose that element of exploring an environment. And so very quickly said, maybe this is a risk we don't need to take.
Right.
And we cut it out of the thing. And for a while it was an open outdoor environment. And we said, well, we never built one of those, and the tool set is marginal for it now. Maybe it's a risk we don't need to take. Or maybe we have better opportunities elsewhere. But then when we got into how the game is built and how, the sort of factional elements of the game, things we've never done before, and then some other things people will find out about which we've never done before at all, those, we took those on as measure risk. Like the Big Daddy for that time was a big risk for that game. And if we didn't take that risk, but you have to measure and be careful. Does that answer that question?
For sure. It's almost like I made a video about this I think a month ago, and I basically said that you shouldn't any business owner should not invest all of their life savings and their time and their effort into something that's not proven to some degree, right? So it's like when you say sort of scale your risk, it's like you prove to yourself in your career that you can make first-person shooters, that Ken is good at leading a team of making first-person shooters, story-driven ones, right? Immersive sim type games.
Yep.
So you've proved to yourself slowly, and you can now scale and scale and scale and scale because you already know what works and what basically generates a return on the investment. And so you would never recommend someone just jump in and create a narrative Lego game, right? Without any experience telling a story at all, right?
No.
Right.
I mean, as innovative as System Shock 2 was, it was built on an engine that we knew could do first-person games that had decent lighting. And we added color to it because actually Thief didn't have color. We had colored lighting. Thief didn't have colored lighting. We had to sacrifice some things, but we thought color was really important for the visual look of the game. But our risk set was much more limited. And as time goes on, you can expand your risk, but you have to be, look, to some degree, success is how good are you at guessing the risk that you succeed at.
Gambling.
Yeah, it's a kind of gambling, and people have different risk profiles at different points in their life. But if you're not taking any chances, then people, I think this happens to a lot of musicians, like famous musicians. When they're 20s, they're breaking new concepts, right? This is extremely true in rock music for some reason, in pop music. Which rock star's career is better in their 70s than in their 20s, right? Where sometimes you have difference, like filmmakers, like, George Miller made Fury Road when he was 70. And that was his best film as far as I'm concerned. It was maybe the best action film of all time. And also full of risks. And in fact, they pulled back on the risks in Furiosa, I think. And that was part of the reason I think that movie didn't do as well, right? Because it was too similar to the first movie without taking the risks that the first one took. I mean, I don't know if you read about it. It was insane. And everybody was miserable. And everybody was in the desert for months. But meanwhile, there's that artifact of this gorgeous artifact of this film that we'll have forever.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's tricky in terms of the industry. Look, the industry was tiny when I joined it. tiny. There was nobody had even heard of it. Like it wasn't games were not. This is probably hard for young people to understand. Games were not part of the public consciousness. They were a weird fringe thing. My whole life has been watching the weird fringe shit I've liked take off and become part. In the '70s, I loved D&D and Marvel superheroes and video games, and those were all weird niche little things. Then which blew up massively over time. But you can also get irrational exuberance. I think the past few years, when people talk to me about these things, same thing for the film industry. Interest rates were extremely low, and people could borrow money effectively free, and people were taking massive amount of investment, a massive amount of risk. And sometimes you can get people, executives, and I include myself as executives, could really misjudge the audience and the desire for, say, certain types of products or certain, modalities like, VR, say, right? Are people going to, if you don't take a risk, you're never going to know that. Like if Atari never took a risk, there never would have been the Atari 2600, right? If Nintendo didn't take a risk, there never would have been an NES. But somebody has to take the risk somewhere. And you look at, Facebook has been trying for many years to make that happen, right? VR happen. And they spend billions and billions of dollars. And so far, it looks like it's still struggling, though it's incredibly great technology. But at some point, maybe somebody will figure out what the problem is and it will become massively adopted. The iPhone was a massive risk, right? People are like, well, why? And people generally, the things that are best are things people don't even know they want or need until they have it in their hands and they go, oh, that's a piece of my life that was that connects a lot of things in my life that make me very happy. But there's no magic formula. You just have to take risks at the level you can take them, and cross your fingers and be honest with yourself and put it in front of people and make sure you can course correct to the best of your ability and hope and pray.
Sure. Do you think that the game industry is particularly more like gambling than most industries?
Well, what do you mean? Because in terms of the economic model, I mean,
it seems to me that the game industry is so expensive because it's like every art form combined into one. It's like this giant culmination of art forms, and you're taking a gamble on every single art form, and that your team is like the perfect team for this one thing. So it just seems like a scarier business model. And people listening right now, they're thinking, I don't want to get into making games if this is a huge gamble.
I would say that, I'll say a couple of things. Yes, it is. I think I've worked in a bunch of art forms. It is the most difficult art form I've ever worked in times 1,000. When you're a screenwriter, you want to add a character, enter Jim, right? If I write enter Jim in my game, it's concept art, it's character modeling, it's rigging, it's animation sets. It's, oh my God, turns out Jim's a terrible character. Well, too bad, right? You better fix it because we can't remodel him. And that scales across the budgets, right? But eventually you have to live with things. Like there's a bunch of stuff that we did. I wrote the "Would You Kindly" scene in Bioshock very early in the project, and I'm like, I wrote this scene, I thought it was really good. Like, okay, now the rest of the game has to sort of lead into this scene. And I knew a bunch of things about the game. It's not like I knew nothing about the game, but I had to live with that because that was one of the most expensive animation things we had ever taken on at the time. So we animated it. We had an actor come in to do a performance. We videotaped it. We animated to that performance, got a little golf club. And we couldn't go back and redo that at the time. We didn't have the budget. So I had to make the game work around that. In terms of if you don't want to be in the industry, look, I think people are not going to like this answer. But anything in the arts, if you feel you can do anything else, and I've worked in the arts and I've worked not in the arts. I was a screenwriter when I was very young, and then I was out of screenwriting because I failed out of it. And I was back in other jobs for years. And when I got back into art, got back into games, I knew that I had to do it and I didn't have a choice. And I was going to live with whatever the consequences were. And I gave up a job that was paying me twice as much on Wall Street as a IT guy.
Wow.
And they offered me a partnership to stay. And I knew it was a huge risk. but I knew if I didn't do it, I would hate myself forever. And I didn't have any money from my parents. I had about, $4,000 in the bank or something, which I've been able to scrounge together. I was almost 30 years old. I was 29. But if you're not sure, this is not just games. I don't think any art is a good field to be in because it's so competitive and so brutal. Because everybody wants to be in it, and it's so hard to make. And you could work on something, and it can get shut down. When you go and you're working in another job, generally you do something and it gets resolved, and you move on to the next thing, and that work is done. Art is much trickier than that. What if you make a game and you're all loving it, you put it in front of testers and they absolutely abhor it? Well, guess what? Your job's not done. Yeah. You got to keep working. And sometimes you got to keep working. And like you said, you have that problem with your narrative. And we had almost exactly the same problem on Bioshock. Everybody hated it when you show it to them. And then you're like, what's wrong? And you guess something that happens in the first 5 minutes, and you hope, and you do it, and you take those 2 weeks and you hope and you pray that it's the right answer. But we both have the same experience. We were honest enough with ourselves and the audience that we found the right answer, and we made it work.
Yep. So it reminds me of, we'll wrap up here, but it reminds me of making a game or making a graphic novel or writing a screenplay. It's like buying Bitcoin. It's like, just be okay with losing it all. Yes, you need to be okay with burning the cash or the time or whatever it took to create that project. And I think honestly, I think most people can't handle that. It's too painful,
It has to be not a choice for you. Like, if you could do anything else, do it, I'd say, right? But some people have to make art. And it was so painful in my life when I wasn't making art. I was so depressed. Art's my salvation, and I'm so lucky to get to do it. And also never forget that every day when you're feeling it's hard, when you're feeling it's terrible, wake up and say, hey, I got paid to be in a meeting about how high the jump height should be for this robot, and who else gets to do that? And look, I've been through it. One day I'll do an interview about all the shitty, horrible things that happen, in my career. But I kind of wasn't surprised because I was in the film industry. I was very young, and I saw the shitty, horrible things that can happen in that career. But at the end of the day, making art is a blessing, and I feel incredibly fortunate.
Yeah. Well, dude, that's a great note to end on. I appreciate your time. And is there anything else you wanted to leave the people who dream of making indie games and get in the game industry? Is there anything else you want to leave them with?
Look, I think one of the ways to marginalize risk is if you can make games at night with your friends and stuff and keep a day job, so you minimize your risk, right? Do something as a product. And when I used to work, I used to go home from my day job and I'd write screenplays at night, right?
Yep. And
it was hard, right? Because I put on plays. Like, I remember I was in New York and I was working a full-time day job. I go home, go to the gym, go to rehearsal, go home, do rewrites from rehearsal, wake up early in the morning, and it was hard, but I did it because I loved making art. And but if you can marginalize your risk in any way, right now there's so many tools, there's so many ways to meet people, to do stuff. It's just coming in for a job interview. If you've done something, if you've done a mod, you've done a project, you're going to be way ahead because you know what it's like to ship something without having to risk your whole life on it.
Oh yeah, that's great advice, especially people in their 20s.
Actually.
The energy starts to go away slowly the older you get, and
kids 20s,
come, right? Oh yeah, kids come, marriage, life happens. Yep. When you're in your 20s, you've got so much time to burn, and don't burn it watching Netflix or at the bar with your friends. Spend some time building a project. I think that's really, really good advice. Cool. Okay, Ken, link is in the description for Judas. Everybody wish list Judas below. Also, the link to your Lego lecture. Is there anything else you want in the description, bud?
No, I think that's it. Just a link to Judas and that. And I really enjoyed the chat. Thanks so much. I love doing developer-oriented talks. I don't get to do them much. They're awesome.
And just remember, don't forget to check out Ovani Sound below. They are the sponsor of this podcast and they make it possible. Thank you, Ovani Sound. It's also a really good value for the price. It includes a ton of essentials and everything you need to start making your games sound professional. The offer really does end in just 1 week, so go check it out by simply clicking the link in the description.